Welcome to the Dispatch Podcast. I'm Declan Garvey, Executive Editor of the Dispatch, and today I am talking to Jonathan Karl, Chief Washington Correspondent for ABC News and the author of a new book called Tired of Winning, Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party, that's out today in bookstores everywhere. I should disclose, I am not a disinterested third party in this conversation. I've been working with John on Tired of Winning since October 2022, but as a result, I'd like to think I have some pretty unique insight into his reporting process, and I hope this conversation helps bring listeners behind the scenes, as well as shed light on some of the true motivations driving Donald Trump's third presidential run. Jonathan Karl, welcome to the Dispatch Podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
So you've got this new book out that you can see here Tuesday, November 14th, called Tired of Winning. And before we get too deep into the conversation, I should disclose that I am not impartial moderator here. I've been working with you on this project for what? It's more than a year at this point, right?
Yeah, you came in at the inception and had a major impact on this book. So thank you for that.
It's been a pleasure. But it's your third book about Donald Trump, following Front Row at the Trump Show in 2020, Betrayal in 2021. This title, Tired of Winning, has a little bit of finality to it in some ways. Do you think is this your last Trump book, or do you see this? What's the word for series with four? Tetralogy?
Yeah, I should disclose that when I wrote Betrayal, the subtitle was the final act of the Trump Show. Now, I've tried to explain. I'm not a political guy, so spin is something I usually like to pierce, not to do myself. But I tried a little bit to say, final act. After the final act, you often have an encore or some kind of an additional thing that happens afterwards. I don't know. I mean, one of the big problems will be coming up with how to describe it, because trilogy does have a nice ring. I don't know if treason trilogy is the right way to describe this, but maybe.
We were talking the other day. Toy Story. They had 1, 2, and 3, wrapped it up nicely in a bow, and then 10 years later, they went with the fourth one to bring a new generation in. So, that could be the path down the road.
And we won't be doing any prequels, so we're not going to be doing the Star Wars thing.
Good. So because this is less a typical interview, I kind of want to bring listeners a little bit into the book writing process. So Tired of Winning was not the original title that you came up with when you first went to the publisher with the proposal. So can you talk a little bit about the original conception of the book and kind of how that conception changed over the course of reporting it out?
Yeah, it's amazing how things changed as you and I started working on this. You came in very, very early in this process, and my idea was to write a book about the sad and lonely demise of a disgraced former president as he faded away into obscurity. I'm only slightly exaggerating that, but that was the feel. He had left the White House as a disgraced president. His second impeachment trial, you actually had 7 members of his own party voting to convict him. He was a pariah. Fox News had basically forgotten who he was. You didn't see him. He was no longer doing interviews on Hannity or Fox and Friends. They had kind of clearly moved on. He was certainly discussed elsewhere, but it was mostly the impeachment trial or then a look ahead to the January 6th hearings. But there was really no sense that this was somebody who would make a political comeback. And the original, kind of a working title I had worked with, I don't know if it would ever have truly made it into final form, was The Biggest Loser. A play off his reality TV, DNA. And the idea is, how could you call him the biggest loser? He beat Hillary Clinton. He won a race. He won maybe as I have said, the biggest upset in the history of American politics in 2016. He presided over 4 years, well, 3 years before we get to the pandemic of peace and prosperity. Low unemployment, low inflation, relative peace around the world. How could you call this guy the biggest loser? But the idea was to be the biggest loser, you have to have a hell of a lot to lose. But as I was working on the book, something strange happened. He reasserted his dominance over the Republican Party.
Yes, he did. And it really started to kind of happen around these indictments that we'll touch on a little bit later in this interview, and we kind of have some very interesting reporting on in the book. Your first two books were obviously about Trump's presidency, his time at the White House. This one touches on a little bit of the end, some of the things that were going on post-election before he left office, but it's primarily about what he's been up to since, at Mar-a-Lago, at Bedminster. How did that affect kind of your reporting process? Obviously, you couldn't go and find everybody in Trump world at the White House every day or at the Trump hotel down the street. They've kind of scattered across the country, and Trump himself is not as accessible to get interviews or to talk to. So kind of how did your reporting process of this book differ from the other two?
Well, first, I should say, I think that the three books, and I have no idea if I'll actually have the desire to do a fourth, God help me. But the three books are in dialogue with each other. I think that this one builds on things that I wrote about and reported on and discussed in books 1 and 2. In fact, as you know, in one of the real pivotal chapters in the book about the launch of the campaign and the theme of retribution that became the animating focus of the campaign, I talk about a book that I wrote almost 30 years ago when I was a young reporter for the New York Post, called The Right to Bear Arms: The Rise of America's New Militias, which was about the militia movement in America that came out of Waco and the Oklahoma City bombing.
And just to
So
interject there real quick, Trump makes a cameo in that book as well.
Yeah, there are so when I wrote the first book, Trump was still in the White House. I was a White House reporter for ABC. And my goal was not to write a polemic about how dreadful Trump is or anything. I mean, it wasn't any, I was not, that was not the purpose at all. I wanted to, the way I remember describing it at the time is I want to write a book that somebody could pick up 50 years from now to answer the question, what was it like? What was it like to be at the Trump White House, to be at the White House with Donald Trump as the president? And then betrayal obviously has a more of a focus and, and is a much more critical look and gets at Donald Trump's responsibility for what happened on January 6th, and not just January 6th, but the entire effort to overturn a presidential election. This one, again, builds on both. I wanted to really, this is not strictly polemic. This is an effort to try to describe this amazing moment in American history and this incredibly improbable story of a president going from defeat and disgrace to mounting a political comeback. He was not cooperative himself. He didn't want to talk to me for this one. I interviewed him twice for betrayal. But what I found is I could talk to almost everybody around him. Some of those interviews on the record, some of them not. One of the characters that makes that is recurrent appearances throughout this book is Steve Bannon, who I think is one of the most important figures in Trump world. I think there's nobody that truly gets at what nobody does more to give Trump some kind of a vision for what he's trying to accomplish than Steve Bannon. For Trump, it's all about, I'm Trump and I'm the greatest and I never lose. But with Bannon, there's that message, that darker side. And I had hours and hours and hours of conversations with him, and much of it on the record and very revealing and very candid. But it's not just him. I spoke to people who, in Mar-a-Lago. I spoke to people in his political universe. All of the people that I dealt with in the White House were gone. I mean, one of the one of the opening scenes in this book is I went down to Mar-a-Lago in November of 2022. It was November 15th. It was the day he announced he was running for president for a third time. And the scene is really, I mean, it's an incredible scene because there's nobody there that helped him win the White House the first or second time. None of the campaign managers are there. None of the significant figures from the campaign are there. There's no Kellyanne Conway. There's no Brad Parscale. There's no Steve Bannon. There's not even Steve Miller. I mean,
family members.
I mean, Jared showed up, but it was very clear he was not going to be part of the campaign. He was there, I guess, to show that somebody bothered to show up. But Ivanka put out a statement explaining why not only was she not there for the announcement, but that she would have nothing to do with his campaign. Don Jr. Had some travel problems, even though he had been there 2 days earlier. They did not show up. And then there wasn't a single confirmed member of his cabinet that was there. None of his former press secretaries were there, and he had 4 of them. None of his former chiefs of staff, and he had 4 of them bothered to show up. You had some of the kind of the kind of D-list figures from Trump world, people like Sebastian Gorka, who barely lasted a few months in the Trump White House, and nobody can really quite figure out what he did while he was there. You had Roger Stone show up, best known for getting both a conviction and a pardon. But, none of the key figures from either the Trump presidency or the Trump campaigns bothered to show up, again, because it had a feeling like it was, there was the stench of a loser around him, and people didn't want to be a part of it again.
That's right. Coming on the heels of last year's midterms, when obviously all the Trump-aligned candidates dramatically underperformed, I should say most, not every single one, but really cost the Republican Party their red tsunami, their red wave, and their chance to control the Senate. DeSantis at that point was really kind of coming into his own. He won a huge re-election victory in Florida. And it seemed like at that point that there was a changing of the guard of some kind. And part of the reason why Trump was announcing his campaign when he was to try and steal some of that momentum back. And
I mean, in fact, because DeSantis had just won that huge re-election victory in Florida, and there was a poll. So the announcement was November 15th, 2022. I just looked back at this recently. There was a poll, a Wall Street Journal poll in the middle of December, so about a month later, and it showed Trump at 36 or 38%, DeSantis over 50. I mean, DeSantis, and again, he hadn't announced he was running yet. DeSantis hadn't, but I mean, it looked like Trump could lose to his, former little minion, DeSantis. So it looked pretty grim, and I'm sure. I mean, we'll get at. I think there's a reason it turned around. I think there are several reasons, but there's a couple of very big ones why it turned around. But you were asking me about the process, and one thing I should say, because I don't know that people really quite get this, because Trump can be absolutely vicious in his attacks on journalists, and he's been very vicious in his attacks on me. Personally, I've known him since 1994, and for many, many years, I had a very good relationship with Trump, including in the Trump White House. They would complain about my reporting, but Trump would always refer to me as somebody who used to treat him really fair. Be nice, John. Be nice. He used to be a fair reporter. But it was somewhat good natured as he could be, talking about the enemy of the people. But I say that I've never had a hard time getting some of those people that you will see the most, vilifying the press, vilifying me, to sit down and talk to me quite candidly about what's actually going on. I mean, it's an astounding thing, and part of it is because there are so many warring factions within Trump world, even now, but especially during the White House era, that people want to talk to you so they can basically dish on the other people that are close to Trump.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about that. I heard a lot of these conversations between you and Steve Bannon. You were very generous in sharing those. But
it's not quite Tuesdays with Maury, but it's like
so, just as revealing, just as enlightening. But he doesn't seem like he's talking to you begrudgingly. He doesn't seem like he's at times even excited to be on the phone with you and to fill you in on what's been happening either at Mar-a-Lago or on the Hill or what have you. What is his what do you think is his rationale for being so open throughout this entire process? We kind of, because we've been reporting this over a year, you kind of can see he wasn't thrilled with Trump and the direction of the campaign in the fall of 2022, and that's kind of adjusted over the course of the year. But why was he kind of trying to coach Trump through the media or get his bigger message out there? Why do you think that he was so willing to talk to you?
You remember there was I don't have the quote in front of me, but shortly after that announcement speech, Bannon was really down on Trump, and he told me about it. And because that speech, that announcement speech, really said nothing. I mean, Jason Miller, Trump's one of his spokesmen, advisors, was very proud that he got Trump to not dwell on the 2020 election, because of course it was all the talk of the 2020 election and stop the steal and all that had been the view, the widely held view, I think the correct view, hurt Republicans in the 2022 midterm. So this announcement was a week later, and Jason and others convinced Trump, don't get out there and talk about 2020. It's not good. So he didn't. So it was teleprompter Trump for the most part. And, he talked through a litany of warmed over policy proposals that he doesn't really give a crap about. He, told a few old stories from the White House, and he announced he was running for president. And one of the things he said is, we're going to drain the swamp. And Bannon, I remember telling me just days later, don't give me drain the swamp. You had a chance to drain the swamp. You filled the swamp. This is Bannon talking to me. And, so why does he do it? I mean, I don't, the honest answer is I don't know for sure. I think that Bannon sees himself as, as something of an historic figure who helped usher this massive change in. It's a revolutionary change, and it's upended one of our major parties, and that it has, the Republican Party. And he thinks that and I think rightly so, that he's the one that's given, as insofar as there is an ideology behind this movement, it comes from Bannon, and he wants to make sure that comes through crystal clear, and it's not just about Trump and his ego, right. That there's a larger world historic agenda going on here. That's kind of Bannon's view of the world. And of course, Bannon's at the middle of that.
I remember early in Trump's presidency that got Bannon into some trouble when he was on the cover of Time magazine, and there was an SNL skit about how he's the one really running the show, and Trump was at some toy president's desk.
Yep.
And they kind of had a falling out,
a huge falling out. It was brutal. Sloppy Steve.
I know. But it seems like they're back together again. He was at Mar-a-Lago for extended periods of time earlier this year. You talk about all the people who weren't at Trump's launch in November of 2022. I think, were he doing it again today, he might have a bigger crowd because people
absolutely
see the writing on the wall here a little bit. But it's not going to be the A team staffing his administration if he is the nominee and wins the general election next year. It's probably not going to be the B team or the C team. So who is he surrounding himself with right now? What does his kitchen cabinet look like? and kind of what would you expect to see different in a Trump administration 2.0?
I mean, he spends so much time now with his lawyers, and Todd Blanche, who's kind of the lead lawyer, is somebody who had no prior ties to Trump whatsoever. He's a former prosecutor, federal prosecutor. He's a pretty good lawyer. I mean, he's a good lawyer. And look, you know, good defense counsel is important. And Trump, there's a great footnote in the book, which I think you kind of helped me pull together, which is a list just off the top of our heads of all the lawyers who have worked for Trump since he came to the White House. Not the government lawyers, not people like Pat Cipollone or Ty Cobb, but like the outside lawyers. And it takes up like a quarter of a page in the book. It's just this list in very small print as a footnote of the names. And Blanche is one of the serious people that's on the legal team. But he's he just by necessity, the political strategy and the legal strategy, and again we can get to this later, but Trump is not particularly strategic about anything, but insofar as there is a strategy, they've merged together, and he is spending more time with his legal team. And Boris Epshteyn is a very key figure, another person who only lasted in the Trump White House for a matter of months, and was not taken particularly seriously by the people that staffed that West Wing. I mean, now he is right there by Trump's side, and he's not arguing in court for Trump. He's not really Trump's lawyer, but he's a lawyer. He went to Georgetown. But Boris is basically, tries to, bring together all the legal, everything legal for Trump, and in a way that really annoys some of the lawyers. Blanche is kind of interesting, Todd Blanche, because Todd Blanche also represents Boris, because Boris has his own issues, of course. So it's highly complicated. He has a pretty, he's got a smaller political staff than he had certainly in 2020, when it was a really big political team. But even as the race got underway in 2016, Susie Wiles is the most important figure. She was, involved in 2020. She's a real political operative. Chris LaCivita, who is somebody that I've known since even before his claim to fame had been Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. If you remember, I think you were maybe
9 years old.
9 years old. I'm sure you were following this intimately. Which managed to portray Silver Star winner John Kerry, Vietnam veteran, as a as a coward, and maybe a traitor, and I mean, it was quite an amazing feat. But he's kind of always been a master of the dark arts. But he's again somebody who had no ties to Trump before he was brought into this campaign. But he's a pretty shrewd operator. So he has some serious political people who I think maybe have more freedom than the political people did in 2016 or 2020, largely because Trump is so tied up in the legal cases.
I want to put on my hard-hitting journalism hat for a second, and there are some anecdotes or stories about those legal teams, kind of the squabbles within them. And, I think one that was published in the Atlantic last week about Trump yelling at one of his lawyers, I think Todd Blanche, who you just mentioned, about how he's going to lose him the case or whatever.
I think he called him "you little f***er," but yes,
there are a lot of these stories that are very personal, very private, and you were able to report them out, get access to them. But, as you mentioned earlier, Trump and some of his people iced you out. You're not necessarily able to bring it to them, say, hey, I heard this. Did this really happen? Is this true? What is your process for deciding when a source talks to you and gives you a story about Trump or something that he did or said or believes? How do you decide what's true and what's false?
It can be very tricky, especially, because the traditional methods often don't work. I mean, not for this book, but there was a story that we had done for ABC a while back where we went to the Trump team. It was a good, it was a pretty significant exclusive report. We went to them for to get reaction and check a few things, and they responded by responding before the story was posted, which is a breach. I mean, it's so you can't always you have to be careful how much you can trust them. In writing Betrayal, I had two interviews with Trump that were, one was quite lengthy at Mar-a-Lago. Another one was fairly lengthy. It was over the phone, and it was right before the book went to press, where I went through, like the dozen or so, most explosive things, and there were a lot of explosive details in Betrayal to get Trump's response. And I couldn't do that this time because he refused to talk to me. And for a while, his people weren't, his official kind of spokespeople were not responsive either. I think they're a little more responsive now because they know that being non-responsive doesn't really help them either. But it's the same. It's journalism. You just have to kind of um, know what your sources, who your sources are, try to get a sense for who you can trust, and to do everything you can to verify. And there were things that I chased down very aggressively that I believed were likely to be true that I did not put in this book because I couldn't get them over. My level of comfort is, am I really satisfied that this is solid?
There are some pretty great details that maybe one day you'll be able to confirm them and get them back. With a lot of these political books, I think you've gotten plenty of it. Maggie Haberman at the New York Times has gotten plenty of it. Bob Woodward, the criticism of you're saving this for the book, you're not reporting it out in real time when there's the power to do something about it. I think that's a pretty unfair criticism. Can you explain?
It's the dumbest. It's one of the dumbest things that I've ever heard said about my work. Oh, how dare you? You held this for your book. You're just trying to cash in. Why didn't you tell us? I mean, writing a book is a different process than doing a story, for the Dispatch, or doing something on ABC News, or writing an article for whatever. I mean, writing a book is an in-depth process. You talk to people. In some cases, you get people who are willing to have really in-depth conversations with you because you are writing a book. Motivations can vary, but often the motivation is to get the historic record straight. And people that don't want to be engaged in the the back and forth of the daily news cycle, but do want to have for history a sense of what really happened. So when people say that, it's like, no, I didn't hold it for the book. I got the information because I wrote the book. I mean, it's right. Entirely. Now, there are some, I think the reason why this generally very stupid criticism, sorry to be blunt, is out there is there have been some issues which had a, kind of a little bit of a point. One was Bob Woodward, when Woodward revealed that Trump had told him, that the coronavirus, this stuff is deadly. It's far worse than the flu. This is really, really, really bad. And then Trump would go out and tell the world it's just like the flu and it's no big deal. But meanwhile, Bob Woodward was having conversations for his book to be published much later, where Trump was confiding in him and saying something entirely different. Now, Woodward did eventually release those audio clips, as I recall, even in advance of his book and before the presidential election, because he thought this was information that people should have. So, again, whatever. I mean, it's, and then I had a circumstance that, as I was writing Betrayal, where I had worked very hard to convince Bill Barr to talk to me. It took me a couple of months of like browbeating, of him to talk to me. He finally agreed to give me an interview, and it was on background. And then I went back and I was like, what you are saying is incredibly meaningful, but it's only meaningful if your name is attached to it. This was the interview that he gave where he first, beyond what he said in December of 2020, he really went chapter and verse into how there, not only was there no major fraud in the 2020 election, but he had investigated all of these major allegations that had come from Trump. And he went on the record and told me the whole story. And that was for Betrayal. That was for a book, but the book wasn't coming out maybe for another 6 months. And I decided I wanted to get out immediately. So I wrote an article for The Atlantic, and I put it out, basically what would become that chapter in Betrayal. But look, I mean, writing a book, and also I love to cash in by writing a book. I mean, I don't know how much people know about the publishing world. I mean, if you get a huge bestseller, yes, you can make money in publishing, but I mean, that's not the motivation. I mean, I wrote these books because I wanted to do something that would stand the test of time and get beyond the crazy, ridiculously rapid news cycle where we forget, the massively insane thing that happened 5 minutes ago because something even more insane happened, 5 minutes hence. So I think these, as I said before, this is the most important work I have done, and information that I got that really broke ground in Betrayal and in this book happened because I took the time and somehow convinced you to come in and work with me on this as well, and did some in-depth reporting and research that I hope ultimately will stand the test of time.
I do think that that's something that I hope people get as they're reading this book. And again, not an impartial observer, but I do think I think your first two books probably had, and we've talked about this, had more newsy nuggets and kind of fun stories, anecdotes. But I think it's really important to get this story out there, frame it in the way that we did, and kind of capture what these last 2 or 3 years of Trump's post-presidency have been like. And I think, kind of turning back more to the substance of the book, that one of the overarching themes and something that we really tried to get across is that Donald Trump today is not the same Donald Trump that most people probably remember from 2020 or early 2021. How he's been in hibernation almost for a couple of years now. He's doing events, but you almost have to seek it out rather than have it kind of come to you or forced on you like it was for 5 or 6 years there. So when people start to tune back in, the media starts to tune back in as the race heats up, what do you think is going to surprise people the most about Trump today versus Trump in 2020?
I think that he's become divorced from reality. That was always there to a degree. I mean, you were almost paraphrasing Ron DeSantis there at the last debate when he said he's not the same guy I ran in 2016. But there's some real truth to it. I mean, one of the things that I found truly shocking, and the kind of cliche about Trump was a lot of shocking, not much surprising, but this actually surprised me, was the degree to which he bought into one of the craziest of all the conspiracy theories. This idea, and it was really something that started with QAnon, that Trump would be reinstated as president. That there was this whole, the dominoes were all going to come down, and the Supreme Court was suddenly going to jump in and say, you know what, that 2020 election, is no good. Biden, get out of the White House. Donald, please get back in there as quickly as you can. I mean, it's insane. Mike Lindell was saying this stuff publicly, doing it. I think one of the first places he did it was on Steve Bannon's podcast, and even Bannon was like, oh, no, what are we doing here? But what I discovered is that Trump was obsessed with it and was talking with everybody about it. And I went back to the interview that I did with him in July of 2021 when I was wrapping up the last book. And right before I did that interview, he'd issued a press release that ended with the lines 2024 or before. And people didn't really pay much attention. That's weird. He doesn't really think, I couldn't. So I asked him about it only because he was sounding like he's like, you're not going to believe the stuff that's coming out. That's why the interview starts. Before I can get my first question, you're not going to believe the stuff that's coming out about, you're going to see, you won't report it, but you're going to see, in Arizona, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and you're going to see all the stuff that's coming out. And, but he was truly trying to encourage this movement to try to upend a presidential election and evict a guy that had been in the White House. I mean, this went on until early 2022.
Yeah. It's
and I don't think people are aware that I mean, how could a guy like think that?
Right. You would know if, like me, for your job you had to read Truth Social every day for 6 or 8 months. That my wife has noted that my
by
mood,
the way, you've been permanently damaged by that experience. So
it's tough to come back from. But
Yeah.
I mean, it truly is like the shock factor is gone. He says some of the most outlandish things that if he had tweeted them in 2017 would be the main story.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because he was off Twitter and he was off Fox News, and he had he couldn't walk into the White House briefing room and have the
Right.
cameras all around him. Nobody was actually paying attention to him. He was in the news, but again, it was because of the investigations.
Right.
But you didn't really have a window into what Donald Trump was actually thinking and saying and believing.
Right.
And that helped fuel his comeback. People didn't get that look that you and I had, deep into the soul of what this guy was up to. And there's a couple things in the book where we talk about, he's down in Mar-a-Lago, weddings are happening, members are having weddings or different events, and Trump shows up to, greet the bride and groom or whatever. And he starts speaking. And some of the little clips come out because people shoot it on their iPhone. And for a while, that was maybe the best insight into what he was thinking and doing. And there's some crazy stuff out there in YouTube land. But again, not many people were actually seeing that stuff.
Right. I encourage anybody listening to this to go seek out those clips. It's like a wedding band or a wedding DJ, and there are probably 3 or 4 of these. It's not an isolated incident. Yep. He's doing this weekend in, weekend out, and it's just a bassist and a singer just standing there waiting for him to stop talking about the domino theory of once Arizona's audit comes in the way that it's expected to, then surely Michigan's state legislature will decide.
And Vermont's doing stuff. Yes, Vermont, what? I mean, some of it's just it's completely divorced from any sense of reality.
Yes, I mean he's down there. This is the former president of the United States. He could be, whatever Obama's been doing, Spotify contracts and and Netflix documentary series and going to all these events. He's in Mar-a-Lago watching OAN broadcast the live stream closed circuit television of the Cyber Ninjas audit. And he goes to Arizona later in the year to give a speech, I think at a Turning Point USA conference. And he's shouting out individual state house members of Arizona who he recognizes from TV. And he says, I've seen you all summer, things like that. He knows these people. That's what he's spending his time doing. And so it'll be interesting to see as he kind of gets thrust back into the limelight here. Is he able to pivot, or is the stump speech and his, the legal case is going to be what consume him?
I mean, if you look at what he's done just over the past month and a half, he has been in court more days than he has done political rallies. So since October 2nd, my count is he spent 8, might be 9 days now, actually, 8 or 9 days in court. This is just on the New York Attorney General civil case against his company. And he wasn't required to be in court except for one of those days, which is when he testified. So, he's still not like out there in the way you would get a political candidate. I mean, the number of rallies are really few and far between. And the number of actual interviews are actually few and far between. So we're not, that's one reason why I feel that this book is by far the most important thing I have done, even most important of the 3, is because I think that it is essential as we get into this election year that people actually see who Donald Trump is right now. He's the most ubiquitous guy on the planet, but I think that I think the poll numbers you see, when especially these hypothetical general election matchup, which doesn't seem so hypothetical anymore, Biden versus Trump, it's like people have this notion of, oh yeah, well, he was president, and again,
Prices were
inflation was
lower.
down,
Yeah.
and the Middle East wasn't in flames, and that's all fine. It's like, okay, fine, but before you go and vote, look at
Right.
what he actually stands for now.
This is the focus of the first chapter of the book that was published by The Atlantic earlier this month, and I think this is one of my favorite details in the entire thing. It's about a speech that Trump gave at CPAC back in the spring. I was there. I think you might have left by then. Lucky you. I was still sticking around. And it's a very weird dichotomy where if you read the transcript of the speech that he gave, it's one of the darkest and most cynical and really sinister sounding things that you've ever seen in American politics. The way he delivered it in the room, it didn't come off that way. It was lighthearted. It was, jokes interspersed here and there. But if you actually look at the words that he's saying, and you talk to Steve Bannon about this after the fact, and he kept using this one phrase to describe the speech over and over and over again: "Come retribution." I just, listening to it, I found that so odd. Googled the phrase, find out that it's from these Civil War historians, published a book in the 1980s, basically making the case that there was a plot by the Confederacy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln and
kidnap
and or assassinate, however things play out. And the code word for that operation was "come retribution." And Bannon, you brought it back to Bannon. He's like, oh yeah, that's
great book. Have you read the book? It's a great book.
So is that the animating focus of Trump 2024? Is it retribution and revenge?
That was the rebirth of the Trump campaign. So that's in the spring. And you had the aborted launch in November. You had DeSantis beating him in several polls, not just that Wall Street Journal poll I mentioned from December. There are polls in early 2023 which show DeSantis in the lead. Trump's campaign is, he's doing things like selling NFTs. Of course, earlier than that, he's dining with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes. It doesn't look at all like a serious campaign. It certainly doesn't look like a campaign that has a message. But he found the message as the indictments came down the pike. Now, that CPAC was before the first indictment, but it was when it was clear. The special counsel had been appointed. It was clear Jack Smith was doing really serious stuff. He wasn't going to just do it to say never mind. There was a real sense that he was facing impending legal peril, and Trump's focus became, and I think Bannon was a big part of encouraging this. That the memorable line was, in 2016, I said, "I am your voice." And then he looks to this election and says, "I am your retribution." And the whole focus is, I am going to get retribution on the people who have wronged you by wronging me. They're coming after me because their real target is you, and I stand in the way. And he really talks about, in very graphic terms, rooting out all the embedded enemies within the U.S. government, that so-called deep state, rooting them out, destroying them, annihilating them. And Bannon, called it the "come retribution" speech. I think it was the beginning of a turn. And by the way, when the Atlantic article ran and Bannon, was facing some blowback because, why are you talking about, about Donald Trump and invoking the Confederacy, and not just invoking the Confederacy, but invoking the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. So Bannon sent me a note just as soon as the article popped, and he hadn't even seen the whole thing yet. He said, I hope you included the predicate. And he put predicate in all caps. And the predicate, Bannon explained to me, was that Abraham Lincoln had ordered the assassination of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, and his full cabinet. So come retribution, the plot to get Lincoln was about, retribution for that. I was like, okay, well, we could get out. I don't really do a whole deep dive, but thank you for completely and totally confirming that you were in fact invoking the Confederacy and talking about Donald Trump. But then that's kind of step one. The next major event in the Trump campaign was his first actual campaign rally of the 2024 campaign, and of course he chose to do it in Waco, Texas. And this is another case.
Very important early primary state.
Yes,
on the Republican calendar.
If you want to win in Iowa and New Hampshire, and you want to get a good run up on Nevada and South Carolina, you have to really reach out to people in Texas and specifically Waco, Texas. No, it's absurd. I mean, there's no reason to be there. And except for the tremendous symbolic value of the fact that was where you truly saw federal overreach by the, what would now be called the deep state, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the FBI, federal marshals, and their efforts to arrest David Koresh and his followers in the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, a siege that ended up a total disaster with more than 50 people killed in an inferno, and became a rallying cry for people who didn't trust the U.S. government, who feel that, plenty of reasons not to trust the U.S. government, but people thought that the U.S. government's out to get us. And this led to the militia movement. This inspired Timothy McVeigh, who 2 years later goes and bombs the Oklahoma City Federal Building. All of that. So when I went to Bannon, I was like, Waco, are you kidding me? What are you, Branch Davidians? He's like, yeah, we're the Trump Davidians. It's explicit. It was meant to show, and remember the context there. Trump gave that first rally not long after the FBI executed the search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. And as we quote in the book, one of the actual Branch Davidians, who is still alive because he wasn't there for the siege, but was a member back then, said, yeah, it's just like, what they did to Trump at Mar-a-Lago. It's just like what he did to the Branch Davidians. So it's really dark and really sinister stuff. And I remember sitting down, and I think you heard this interview too, with Bannon at one point, and there were incidents that made you really feel like things could turn violent pretty quickly. There was the incident in Ohio where a crazed gunman attacked an FBI field office, and I asked Bannon, "Aren't you afraid of violence? That this could all turn violent?" And his answer to me was, "No, because we're going to win."
That's ominous. It's difficult. We're sitting here recording this on Thursday. The book comes out on Tuesday. The Republican junior card debate was last night, and it's jarring, having gone through this process of working on this book, to see those five candidates on the stage talking about, should we frack in the Everglades or only 20 miles outside the Everglades,
or should we combine Israel aid with Ukraine aid, or should they be separate bills?
Right. I mean, all of this stuff they're important issues. They're incredibly important issues, but against the backdrop of what we're talking about right now, and that person is quadrupling all of them in the polls, it just seems, a little bit quaint to be covering that stuff in a more traditional way.
You and I had kind of an ongoing debate as we were going through, doing the research and reporting on the book, I was pretty explicit that I did not think that he would be the Republican nominee again, even as he gained strength and started to trounce all his rivals. I word it a little differently now. I think I say I still think that I still think he can be beaten. I mean, he's obviously the prohibitive front runner. It's hard to imagine any of those people on that little stage, suddenly surging in the polls. But I think it's still possible for the reasons we've discussed. I don't think that the polls reflect a deep understanding of that dark, ominous message that he has now, and also more generally the kind of weirdness and divorce in the way he's divorced from reality. Um, but I mean, that was like a Twilight Zone debate in another dimension where Donald Trump almost didn't exist. I mean, the first question was about Trump, and even in the answer to the first question, there wasn't much engagement. And then they were off into not only the issues you mentioned, but also kind of petty attacks on one another. Whether or not Nikki Haley wanted Chinese business, whether what I mean, to come to South Carolina when she was governor, and whatever lobbying or whatever. I mean, look, it was like kind of petty, um, you know, cheap Oppo research stuff, and almost no mention of the guy that has a 30 to 40 point lead over all of them. But he is incredibly volatile, as I think comes through in this book. More so, he's always been a mercurial, and I mean that Lord knows I covered 4 years of that White House. I know what it was like. But there were restraining influences on him. Often it didn't work very well at restraining him, but there were people around him who would try to pen him in and try to undermine him. We talk about this in the book a bit. Those people are gone. They are gone. They are not there anymore. And as we actually get into a campaign, let's see where this goes.
That is, I think, a good place to leave it. It's there's a whole lot more where that came from in the book. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us on the Dispatch podcast today, and thank you for bringing me along on the journey the past year. It's been enlightening.
It was fascinating, enlightening, if not always uplifting.
Yes.
Thank you, Declan.
Yes.